Welcome to the session today. My name is Susie McDonald, and I'm the Director General of the Workplace Hazardous Materials Directorate at Health Canada. I'm here with my colleagues. Bill Perry is the Deputy Director of Standards and Guidance at US OSHA, and Maureen Ruskin, the Director of the Office of Chemical Hazards. I think that we have a small session today with about 27 or 30 stakeholders, so I'd encourage you guys to move up and or sit at the table if you'd like, so we can have a more intimate discussion around all of this. The idea for the session today is really going to be to give you an update on progress to date, but also an opportunity to hear your views on where we're going, some of the next steps that we're proposing. So I think what we're hoping for is about 25 minutes overview and a bit of explanation, and then a really solid discussion around where your concerns are, the next steps, how we can engage you, and moving forward, and so forth. So I'd like to start maybe with just a round table with who's in the room, and then we'll get started.
Warrington Ellicott Whirlpool Corporation.
Robert White, Consumer Health Products Canada.
Jay Sorois, Consumer Healthcare Products Association.
Jay West, American Chemistry Council.
Michael Arts, Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association.
Suzanne Beatty, Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association.
Michelle Sullivan, GHS Consultant.
Roberto Barrios, Office of Management and Budget, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
Ken Stretch, Privy Council Office.
Kristen Hendricks, EPA Office of Pesticide Programs.
Jennifer Lawless, US OSHA.
Dina Holmes, OSHA.
Kathy Landcrown, OSHA.
Andrea Peart, Canadian Labour Congress, Congrès du Travail Canada.
Rich Sedlak, American Cleaning Institute.
John Abbott with Syngenta.
Julia Reed, the Association of Global Automakers.
David Adams, Global Automakers of Canada.
John Worgan, Health Canada.
David Moran, Environment Canada.
Brad Fisher, Environment Canada.
Courtney Hagan, Nickel Institute.
Great, thank you all very much. Bill, I'd like to let you say a few introductory remarks.
Thank you, Susie. Yeah, just a couple of brief remarks. We at OSHA think that this has been a very successful collaboration, and we're very appreciative, really, of the opportunity to work with Health Canada in our respective efforts to adopt the globally harmonized system. We really think that we've learned a lot from this process. And we think that the effort lays a good solid groundwork really for future collaborations as the GHS is revised and improved in future years. In this session, and I think you'll see this from the presentations that you'll hear today, I think that you'll see that this effort, we'll be very interested in your thoughts so far on where we are now with these efforts and and your ideas on how you think we can best move forward down the road as we go. So, Susie?
Great, thanks, Bill. So Maureen and I are going to do the presentation together today. We'll just sort of go back and forth as we go through. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. And otherwise, as I said, we'd really like to focus on the discussion at the end and your questions there. So I've often said that our initiative, number 27 out of 29, is slightly different than many others. And that's because we are aligning to an international standard. So the US was already on a path to implement the GHS. Canada had been saying for a number of years, in fact, I think we sort of said we'd have it implemented by 2008, that we were moving forward with GHS. We'd been working on this international standard for more than 20 years at the UN level. And so what really became the issue for us was around how could we align our systems and how could we do it in a way that would make sense from both points of view. So that's what our focus is. So the actual commitment that was made was to align and synchronize the implementation of common classification and labeling requirements for workplace chemicals within the mandate of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration and Health Canada. Doing that through making compatible our respective standards-related measures and enhancing and strengthening the sharing and exchange of regulatory information. So fairly high level, but I think the issue for us was that the U.S., almost at the time when our work plan was posted, was already issuing its final rule. And so Canada was starting a little bit behind there in that our regulatory process hadn't started. So aligning and synchronizing in our perspective, from my perspective, means catching up a little bit to what the U.S. is doing, but it also gives the added benefit that we know what the U.S. is doing. And so we have the ability to look carefully at what they're doing, look at it from the Canadian perspective and how that makes sense in Canada, and then see where there's room for alignment and where there will be differences. Which brings me to the next slide. So some of the key principles that we're using in the implementation is that there should be no reduction in worker health and safety in either jurisdiction. And this is an important one from our perspective. And if you have been engaged in the consultations around the regulations, you'll note that some of them, I'll take the issue of carcinogenicity in particular, where Canada has laid down a marker where it's very likely there will be a variance in our proposal based on the GHS compared to what the US is doing. And that's because we've already had a standard in Canada that we're not going to move away from. Respecting the respective regulatory processes, so the US has a very different system than Canada does, so we need to make sure that those work together. And then respecting the legislative framework, and that's essentially some big words, but in terms of the GHS, really that means, you know, we have a requirement in Canada for bilingual labels, for example. The US will not be requiring bilingual labels. We will not be aligned on that kind of front. I think the other key point really is that in Canada we have a criminal statute, and that means that definitions and regulations need to be very, very clear, because we cannot hold you criminally liable if we're not being very clear on what we're expecting you to do. The US has a bit more latitude, I would say, to offer some guidance through technical guidance, whereas in Canada, as I said, it needs to come out in the regulation itself. So that's where the legislative framework is slightly different from our perspective. Lauren?
Thank you. So when we started out with building up the work plan for the RCC, we had four distinct deliverables. And it was to, one, to establish a mechanism to coordinate the implementation of the GHS and future updates on the GHS. And as Susie pointed out, we were ready to go final. So really the emphasis here is also not only on adopting the GHS, but how do we align in the future as well. And also as part of one of the work plan was to have a permanent mechanism to set up a process for stakeholder involvement, to coordinate our technical interpretations related to the GHS, as well as implementing the GHS itself. We have been working very nicely informally with Canada throughout the years for the last 2 decades, over 2 decades, and really we were viewing the RCC to institutionalize this relationship, because people are retiring, people do move on to other jobs. In this way, we will keep this collaboration going. So one of the first products that we were, one of our first deliverables was an MOU, which would institutionalize this relationship. And we're happy to announce that yesterday we formally signed this MOU. And with it, it will establish the collaborative process. And this is a way to reach common decisions on interpretations and implementation of the GHS. It will formally establish a working group between the US and Canada to be able to work on common positions before the UN, as well as to collaborate on guidance documents and educational documents as well. It also outlines common principles, which is maintaining the same level of protection for workers, as well as harmonization not only of classification, but of the hazard communication, labeling, and other elements as well. So we have also established methods for stakeholder involvement. Back in about a year and a half ago, when we had the first stakeholder meetings here for the RCC, I heard very clearly from our U.S. stakeholders that we should be having routine meetings prior to the subcommittee meetings. We have started to do that for each meeting. We are also coordinating with our counterparts at the Department of Transportation, which will enable stakeholders that participate in both to have easier access to both of these meetings. And Health Canada has also started to have routine meetings as well prior to the UN subcommittee meetings. Back in April and March of last year, we did both US and Canada had meetings on the RCC just about what the work plan initiatives would be and to explain the process to people as well.
So Health Canada and US OSHA right now meet via teleconference about twice a month. And what we do is we review the technical interpretation, we provide the regulatory updates. So frequently I'm asked by my Canadian stakeholders, is this really what US OSHA is doing? My US counterparts say that's not what it means on the ground. And so that gives us the opportunity to go back to Maureen and say, Maureen, the Canadians are saying that's not what's happening in the US. Is this really your interpretation? How is that working? And it's allowed us to work out a lot of issues in terms of our own regulatory process. And I think not to speak for my U.S. counterparts, but I think from their perspective too, to understand that there may be misunderstandings in the U.S. or that some people might be interpreting things differently. That back and forth communication has been very, very helpful in moving the project forward. I think another key point is that Health Canada and the provinces and territories, we've put in place a training working group that's going to feed into the development of common and joint educational materials with the U.S. And part of that is because while US OSHA has jurisdiction for workplace health, both federally and then at that state level to some degree in Canada, the provinces and territories have jurisdiction over employer education. And so we've been working with our provincial and territorial counterparts to make sure that they're involved in the process and that we're engaging them in our interactions with the U.S. around how will we make sure that workers in Canada and the U.S. are trained the same way, that suppliers have the same kind of information and that work.
Oh, and along those lines, the U.S. is still working on our technical documents, particularly our hazard classification document, which we anticipate should be available or at least in final review come this fall. So.
Yeah, and then the last work plan item, as you know, was implementation of GHS, and I guess from a Canadian perspective, you're wondering where we're at. Before we go into next steps around that implementation, I just want to mention quickly that Canada had been chairing the UN Subcommittee of Experts on the GHS. And Kim Hedrick, who many of you might know, had been chairing that subcommittee for a number of years. She stepped down in December. And we're pleased to announce that Maureen has taken up the lead for that subcommittee and that Canada endorsed that at the UN level. And from our perspective, that's a very good flow in that it allows us to continue to make sure that our positions are coordinated and that we're doing that work together. So,
one thing that, as stepping up as chair, that I do want to say, one of the important things about this subcommittee that we've always valued is that it works on consensus. And that will be one of the very important things that I keep going, that I make sure that that keeps going in the UN subcommittee.
So the next item in terms of next steps is the Canadian Regulatory Initiative. And I know that in the work plan, the public work plan on the RCC website, we've indicated that we would consult on the Canadian regulations in spring 2013, and yesterday or today is the last day of spring 2013. But I am happy to announce that Health Canada will be in the coming weeks posting a draft of our regulations for consultation. We anticipate that consultation will happen over the summer and with a closing date around the middle of September. In the Canadian system, normally you would need to have tabled legislation, and for our US counterparts, they've explained to me that tabling means hiding it, but in Canada it means putting it on the table and sharing it. So you would normally have to table legislation before you would be able to share a regulation, and Canada has not tabled legislation with regard to our Hazardous Products Act. What we've done instead is we will not be posting the regulation in Canada Gazette. We will be posting a notice of intent in the Canada Gazette around the regulations, and then doing a consultation with our stakeholders. It's a public consultation in advance of the CG1. Essentially, our hope is to have a robust consultation prior to publication in CG1 so that we're as close to final by the time we get to CG1 as possible. There are some ongoing issues or consultations that will also need to take place over the summer and into the fall, and part of that is related to the publication of a regulation from the Canadian perspective. We do know that there are some ongoing variances. We do know there are some issues that stakeholders have raised that we have not yet been able to address, one of which is combustible dust, for example, and I think Maureen does have a plan at the UN level for looking at that. Another one is classification for kits, for example, that's been raised as an ongoing issue where there might be a lack of alignment. So what we're really hoping to hear from stakeholders over the summer and into the fall is, what are the areas of concern around the regulation? Where are the areas where there's lack of alignment? Do we have a good reason for that lack of alignment in terms of worker health and safety, or the legislative framework, or the regulatory framework? Going back to some of what Bob was talking about this morning, that sometimes there are good reasons for regulatory differences, and just making sure that we have sound reasoning when there are differences. And also just understanding, I think, from both of our perspectives, what that means for folks on the ground, right? Often a regulation, as you write it into the regulation, it looks like it makes sense. And then we'll hear from industry, for example, that it's not the same kind of information being shared back and forth, or that our wording is slightly different, and so the outcome is different. And those are the kinds of things that we're hoping to hear.
So we also look forward to hearing what the comments are on the Canadian regulation, and to see how we can further align. As I mentioned before, we have some technical guidance that we've been working on. The hazard classification one is one that should be done, be finishing up over the summer, and should be ready for publication in the fall. And we are also working on a model training program, which we hope to collaborate with Canada on that as well, so that it can be one training course that maybe both countries can use.
And then obviously from the Health Canada perspective, as Maureen said, following up on that training course is really important. It is the next big item on the work plan for us. And of course, Canada is going to consult on our proposed regulations, and there's still a requirement, of course, to table legislation to make the full suite of changes that need to be made to implement GHS fully in Canada. And our work plan indicates, of course, June 2015 as the date for implementation, and both countries are striving to make sure that we remain synchronized and aligned and able to meet that timeline. And I think the last point in terms of the next step is that we are looking at a potential for a fall meeting around the Canadian regulations, and as Maureen said, the U.S. technical guidance for hazard classification. When both of those documents are available, and once Canada has comments back on our regulation, that would be a good opportunity, we thought, to re-engage stakeholders and make sure that we're moving in the right direction. So that's, I would say, more or less it for the update. I don't know, Maureen, was there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it. Look forward to hearing people's comments, questions.
We did just put 2 questions up, but we're happy to take any questions. But one is, is there a key milestone where a public meeting would be useful? Is this fall meeting, as we're suggesting, that right opportunity? And secondly, are there key alignment issues that are of concern to you that we should be aware of now as we're moving forward? And perhaps a third one is really around the issue of next steps, and are there things there that you would like to see or that are in line with the work plan that we have maybe not considered, or that might be a good path for moving forward? And of course, as Maureen indicated, perhaps the biggest issue for us now that the regulations and other things are on that path is the UN is already at a revised edition again, and how we're making sure that we remain in step and in sync as we continue to move forward, so that both countries are implementing the same kinds of changes at the same times. So the microphone's coming.
So I just had a couple of quick questions and then a larger one. I'm just wondering if there's a plan to have joint common materials. Will there be, this is more of a Canadian question, will there be materials available in non-official languages?
In non-official languages?
That's right.
Yep, to tell you, Andrea, we are not there yet in terms of the thinking. I know that some provinces and territories have raised it as a concern and or an issue, and they've already identified to us which languages their materials are already available in, so we have a bit of a repertoire of what's available, and we'll be looking through that.
That's great. Our concern is that we've seen it unnecessarily be repeated in different jurisdictions, and I think it's an ideal opportunity to share resources when possible. So the other question is just, you mentioned the training course. When will it be publicly released that there will be the training course available? Just because there's already consultants selling right now in Canada GHS compliance courses. We certainly firmly believe this stuff needs to be free, public, so that we have a maximum compliance.
I don't have a date right now. We are just starting to confer with our training institute that's out in Chicago and packaging it. So it will not be before the fall, but now that we have the MOU, we will bring in Canada, and hopefully with the additional resources, we'll be moving that along as well.
Okay, those are my 2 quick questions. Now the bigger question, I wondered if you could comment on Proposition 65 and California, and sort of, I guess, what the spirit of the initial principles of GHS, and providing more information to workers, the public, and protecting the environment. And just curious what's going on with that. From a Canadian perspective, we've heard a lot about what's happening in California, so I'm curious to have your perspective on that.
It's difficult for me to comment on that right now, since California is still in their process of getting stakeholder comments. I know they just recently made available the stakeholder comments, and we haven't seen their final regulatory text. So once we've seen their final text, we will be able to review it and see how it aligns or how it interacts with our hazard communication standard.
So it seems like they will go down, right?
California has their own laws and statutes, which they also have to follow. They are allowed to have their own standard, as long as it is at least as protective and is not unduly burdensome on interstate trade. And so we will be looking at it from those point of views.
Had a quick question for you. I think during the process in the U.S., it was identified that there were some complexities between adopting GHS from an OSHA standpoint versus those from a FIFA labeling standpoint, and there were some conflicts there. And I made note that you were going to do some training, and I just wondered how that will play into your training process.
How we fix that gap is that EPA published a PRN notice to to indicate how a pesticide producer could have a compliant safety data sheet with the EPA labeling. We can have a module like that in our training. I don't think I have one right now written, but I think the PRN notice very nicely does examples and explains how you can have the safety data sheet and have it in compliant with the FIFRA label. I hope that answered your question.
Let me cogitate on that.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I understood some of the things you said, and one of the things you brought out was that I guess because of the Canadian regulatory structure, you have to have very specific definitions for things. And so the two things I would like to bring up are combustible dust and hazards not otherwise classified. And I wasn't actually sure what you said about combustible dust. Was it that the UN is going to look at that, or what did you say? I didn't quite catch it.
So Canada is in our regulation proposing a definition for combustible dust. It does differ from what the US currently has, and our definition is more specific. So again, folks who've been involved in the consultations likely have seen where we're hoping to go with that. I do think, though, and I'll let Maureen speak to it, that combustible dust is on the biennium work plan for the UN.
Yes, at the UN level, there is a work group on combustible dust. Kathy Lancrone is chairing that work group. For the terms of reference, we are reviewing the possibility of providing further guidance on for combustible dust or creating a new chapter for the GHS itself, creating a hazard class of combustible dust. So this is just starting up for this biennium, and we'll be starting to talk about it either, probably not this session, but probably in the session in December.
With regard to the question of hazards not otherwise classified, the U.S. has one category called hazards not otherwise classified. In Canada, we're proposing two categories, physical hazards not otherwise classified and health hazards not otherwise classified, primarily because we are no longer, the proposal is to no longer require that you list the identity of all of the chemicals in the physical hazards, so we're distinguishing those two categories for that reason, because the requirements under each category are slightly different. So again, that's another area where we'll need to determine whether or not on the ground that means there's an actual difference, right? Doesn't matter that in Canada we're having two separate titles. Is the outcome the same then with the hazards not otherwise classified?
Could I ask a follow-up? So that you have not proposed a definition for your health hazards not otherwise classified and your physical hazards not otherwise classified. Is that what I heard you just say?
So they are defined in the regulation. They are defined in the regulation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this question, and I probably haven't kept up to date enough on this RCC initiative, so excuse me if I'm saying something that sounds really stupid, but I'll ask anyway. When WEMIS originally was in place in Canada, it did have an exemption for drugs in finished dosage form.
Mm-hmm.
How is that being addressed under the GHS?
So that's an excellent question. So in Canada, under Section 12 of the Hazardous Products Act, there are a series of products or sectors that are excluded, 12 sectors specifically. And those were excluded at the time when WMIS was first created. They were sort of set aside because most of them were covered under other pieces of legislation. So drugs, for example, was covered under the Food and Drugs Act in Canada, and they were labeled already. So the decision was that they would be set aside and that they would be looked at a later time. They were then reviewed in 1992 through a parliamentary committee in Canada, and some recommendations were made around that. So right now, the Hazardous Products Act, as I said, excludes those 12 sectors. 8 of those 12 sectors are covered to some degree based on my analysis in the U.S. But those are part of the legislation, and so until legislation is tabled, there's no defined path forward for those.
Thank you.
I'm not really clear on what the no defined path forward really means. So my understanding from the minister was that the WMIS exclusions were all being dealt with under the GHS. Would that be correct?
So your understanding from the Minister of Health?
12 out of 12.
So, so in the Canadian system, anything that is part of legislation is part of sort of cabinet confidence until it's tabled. And so when that becomes tabled, then the issue of exclusions will be able to address them and talk to you about them. But until the legislation is tabled, I'm not at liberty to talk about the exclusions.
Now I understand. Okay, thank you. I just have another little question just on combustible dust, because I understand wood products are not going, wood products aren't going to be labeled, but then combustible dust, we'd have issues with wood. So is wood dust included in combustible?
So right now, by virtue of the fact that in the current HPA, wood is one of the products that are excluded, it doesn't fall under the capture. So again, it's something that we need to look at again once the legislation is tabled.
So this one's looking at more of the present, maybe. I don't know if you can answer it, but some companies, I understand, are already using OSHA 2012 labeling. Do you in Canada, are you seeing that, and do you have a reaction or relationship? I'm not sure how it works if they're already moving ahead with OSHA labeling in the U.S. in some cases.
I think it's a good question, and it's something that we're struggling with a little bit in Canada. So in Canada, by policy, we accept the 16-header safety data sheet, but you still need to classify your products in accordance with the current Hazardous Products Act and the current controlled product regulations. So a label that comes in that's compliant with OSHA currently is non-compliant in Canada. Have we seen issues of that in Canada? On the labeling side, I have less information. I think that we do have anecdotal evidence that there might be some safety data sheets that have come in that are GHS only and so not classified according to the HPA and the CPR, and we're looking at that with our enforcement officers.
Could you just elaborate a bit more on that when you say you're looking into that with your enforcement officers? In what direction are you looking at here? As in an enforcement activity or guidance, or how to deal with that in the interim?
Yeah, so first off, that was a wishy-washy answer, wasn't it? Yeah. Not at all, not at all. I don't mind. That's what we're here for. So on the first hand, it's that we only have anecdotal evidence, and so we've heard it, but we've not actually seen it. So we've asked our inspectors to forward it when they do see them on the ground. Secondly, indeed, we're looking at whether or not there's some sort of need for transitional measures or how we're going to define that. But currently in the legislation, it's very clear, and if my lawyer was sitting next to me, they would say, there's no movement there. The HPA and the CPR are what they are. You need to comply, period. The question for us becomes, in terms of as we move forward to implement GHS, are there ways that we can look at that and work with employees to make sure they know what's going on? So that's still very much up in the air, to answer your question, but it's very much on our radar. Somebody will bring you a mic, I think.
This is not on. Is it? Is it?
We can hear you.
All right. Thank you. Back to the pesticides and FIFRA versus the GHS requirements. Will you? Because I guess the concern of the registrants obviously is that not necessarily headquarters at EPA, but the regional offices, and perhaps even the states might not be well versed in the solution that EPA has offered us concerning the PR notice. So will there be, I mean, are there efforts in place to do some training or at least provide guidance to the states in particular, but then also to those regional offices so that they will I'm sorry, EPA's over there, so that we have sort of a consistent approach?
Well, I work for OSHA, so it's very difficult for me to talk with EPA. So I will hand the floor over to my colleague from EPA.
Thank you. This is Kristen Hendricks from the Office of Pesticide Programs. Right now, we don't have anything in place to do training. We did a lot of outreach when the PR notice was published last spring, last April. It's certainly something we can look into, and we can talk to our stakeholders both in the state and the regional offices. I myself, I have gone to meetings with state agencies and, giving a presentation and, giving them my card and my name and telling them to call me. So, I mean, we've done some outreach as state agencies come into our headquarters building. In fact, I was at a CTAG meeting last week. I don't even know what CTAG stands for, but I went to their meeting and I told them all about the PR notice. So we do as much as we can, but there's nothing formally set up. So it's something that we can look into and see if there's interest.
Is it one venue that might be a good one to use would be at the APCO meetings, the FIREG meetings?
Yes,
because
I've been at those meetings too, and I've talked about the PR notice. Yeah, that was 2 or 3 months ago, I think. Back in April, I went to an APCO meeting. Yeah.
That just, again, I just want to underline, that is an area of great concern and anxiety among the pesticide registrants. So any efforts that can be made to ensure that approach is conveyed to not only your OECA, but your regional offices and the states would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'll talk to my management and get on the schedule for those meetings as well. Thank you.
This is just a note concerning material safety data sheets in Canada. Even though we are still following the HPA and CPR as far as the content, we have been advised by the Hazardous Materials Information Review Commission that we must use the GHS format.
So by policy, we accept the 16-header format. There's no obligation for you to use that 16-header format.
We did a submission for, and they said that it wouldn't be accepted unless we changed it and that we must use that format.
Well, so for those of you that don't know, in Canada there is a commission, or there was a commission called the Hazardous Materials Information Review Commission. That commission was established primarily to balance the industry's right to have sort of trade information be kept confidential and the workers' right to know. That commission, the roles and responsibilities of that commission were transferred to Health Canada on April 1st, 2013. The folks that were in that commission are now part of my directorate, the Workplace Hazardous Materials Directorate. So there might be some things that we're looking at. In some cases, I think this is exactly one of the great reasons of bringing all of what was the WMIS program and the commission together under one sort of heading, is that these kinds of things will be worked out more easily. And so certainly I can look into that for you, Jeanette.
Well, we've changed it.
Okay.
Good, but I just brought that up at the time.
Yeah, no, and that's useful information.
That's what we do. So.
Yep.
I think in one of the slides there, you had the 2 other areas of consultation were still the combustible dusts and the kits. But you did make reference as well to the breakdown of the physical hazards not otherwise classified and the health hazards. Is that still something that's being discussed? Because that still is a concern for us with regards to, products that's moving across the border and then the creation of and the identification of what those categories would be and then the appropriate labeling.
Absolutely. So I think I identified, 2 issues where we are currently ongoing in sort of current discussions around that. The issue of physical hazards not otherwise classified and health hazards not otherwise classified, we've discussed too. I think that's part of the process of asking for comments and feedback on the proposed regulation, is to get those kinds of information back into us. I think we went from a system or, a series of proposals where we had, maybe don't quote me on this, but over 32 identified variances with US OSHA. We've been able to minimize that to a great degree. There are some where, as I said, those variances are very likely to stay, and I think I mentioned those at the very beginning, right? The carcinogenicity one, for example, is one where we've had that standard in Canada. To move away from it very likely is a reduction in worker health and safety. There are other ones, as I said, where we were able to identify that the variance, while it might have been there, or we might have had a standard in Canada, we couldn't identify that there was a worker health and safety risk by aligning. So we've done that. If our information is incorrect, this is the time to bring that information forward. Likewise, if we've made a decision on something, or we put forward a proposal on something where we're recommending a variance, and for whatever reason there's no need for that variance, then we're happy to hear that as well, right? That's part of what the consultative process really is all about, to be able to hear from all of your perspectives, from the worker perspective, from the industry perspective, from our PT counterpart perspective, frankly, where the issues lie, and then we can work together to resolve them.
Can I ask a process question? So we're talking about next steps, okay? And so up there you have 2 next steps, right? And so I'm a little confused with like process. So the work plan that's on the website is dated 2012. That will stay? You're not going to change that? These are questions.
Yep, so the work plan that's been published is, it remains the work plan that we're working towards.
And these are products of that work plan.
Okay.
So yeah, I apologize. We should probably have the work plan here, but our work plan essentially had these sort of areas for next steps,
They
right,
were
including
broad
the education.
deliverables.
And oh, there we go. She's got it.
Unfortunately,
not in the form, but you'll see right under action item 4. We always had there, right, that Health Canada would amend the Hazardous Products Act, and that we would table legislation, and that we would amend the Controlled Products Regulations. So that's more or less what you're seeing on the screen there.
And so I understand, although I actually haven't seen it yet, that this memorandum of understanding is published, is going to be published. It will be on the web. That's my question.
Oh, yes, it was just signed yesterday. The ink is barely dry, so it will eventually be up on at least our website. On our
That's OSHA's website or the USARCC website?
I'm sorry, OSHA's website.
Okay.
And they've also asked for, OMB has also asked for a copy. So you may see it there as well.
Okay. I didn't actually know where to go to look, whether I should be looking on the RCC website.
I would say I'll send out a note to our
With a link?
stakeholders with a link when it's up.
Okay, thank you.
There may be a little bit of a delay on the OSHA website. We've been a little backlogged in just getting things posted. So.
And in terms of the RCC, I can check with our secretariat, and of course, it would be made available in English and French on that website.
So we had expressed a lot of concerns about manufactured articles, and because of the way it was defined, it didn't include maintenance, and so there was a discussion around either defining use or changing the definition for manufactured article. But I understand it got volleyed to Cal OSH. Was there has that been resolved?
You know, Andrea, I'm not going to be able to answer that question because I didn't go back and look again at the regulation, although it is an issue that we've discussed at length. Of course, manufactured articles as well are one of the areas where there remains an exclusion. So,
Just because you hadn't mentioned it, so I thought I was like,
Yeah.
maybe it's resolved.
Yeah.
It's still on the pile. Okay, thanks.
Hi, Robert Keefe with American Chemistry Council.
this entire process has been talking about harmonizing the processes between the two agencies and the approaches to GHS, yet we're also identifying many differences here in how we're going to actually execute it. At some point in time, will you produce a document or something that identifies what the differences are between the two regulations?
So I think that's a good point, and frankly, one that I hadn't thought of, so let me put that there.
That would be very
Yeah.
useful.
But I think again, from our perspective, we've got a final rule in the US, so until we have a final regulation in Canada, it would be preemptive to do that, right? So right now we're still working out what some of those issues look like. Okay, so last call for questions? No? I would like to thank you all for, yep.
Have you just recorded this session?
It is recorded, and apparently it will be made available, is my understanding. So I'm looking to Ken at
That
the
was
back.
my
He's
question.
saying
I'm
yes.
sitting there looking at this thing,
Yes.
and it looks as though you were recording it.
Yes.
And so it will be on the RCC website,
It'll be on the RCC website, yeah. Okay. And I think that's, again, what our folks were talking about this morning, and that we'd like to be able to reach out to a broader group of people. I know there were Canadians who couldn't be here today, so they're looking forward to seeing this session, I think, on the website. So again, from my perspective, thank you for participating in this session. It's been very helpful. Thank you as well for all of your input over time in terms of the regulations, both from the U.S. perspective and the Canadian perspective. Maureen?
I guess when the U.S. is regulating, I always put out a call and tell people to please participate. So on behalf of Canada, I will say please participate in their regulation, because the more information, more input they get, the better the regulation is and the better our alignment will be. So.
Thank you. Bill, did you want to say a few words? No. Thank you again. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
No, okay. Thank you again all very much, and indeed, please do put forward your comments. Thank you very much. Thank you. There was one of the questions that I didn't understand what it was.